Brandon Reeves had always dreamed of owning a piece of land where he could create something meaningful: an organic farm, a thriving garden, or simply a sanctuary where nature could flourish. After years of saving and planning, he finally found the perfect property: a quiet house with a spacious plot of land nestled in a small, seemingly peaceful town. The plot wasn't just a patch of earth to him, it was his future. A blank canvas where he envisioned rows of colorful plants, buzzing beehives, and the tranquil sound of a nearby brook. When Brandon first moved in, everything seemed ideal. The neighbors were polite but kept their distance. The house had a sturdy foundation, and the soil showed potential for agriculture. He spent his first week unpacking and sketching plans for the land, walking the perimeter daily to connect with the space he now called his own. It wasn't long before Brandon noticed something peculiar. A tall, imposing fence cut across the eastern edge of his property, extending well into what should have been his land. The fence was sturdy, made of dark wood, and clearly built recently. It didn't match the rustic charm of the other fences in the neighborhood, which were weathered and unassuming. It was almost as if someone wanted this boundary to be impossible to ignore. Brandon checked the property survey he'd received when he bought the house and confirmed his suspicions: the fence encroached on his land by at least 2 meters. Initially, he brushed it off, assuming it was an honest mistake by the previous owner or a misunderstanding with the neighbor. He decided he would address it later, after settling in and prioritizing other aspects of his new life. A few weeks later, as Brandon began preparing the soil for planting, the fence became a bigger nuisance. It cast a shadow over the best part of the land, an area that received the perfect amount of sunlight and was ideal for the beehives he planned to install. The more he thought about it, the more it irked him. This wasn't just a fence, it was a violation of his property rights. Determined to resolve the matter amicably, Brandon approached the neighbor who owned the adjacent lot. Her name was Evelyn Stanton, a woman in her late 50s with an air of entitlement that became apparent the moment she opened her door. She greeted him with a tight-lipped smile, her posture exuding impatience, as though she had already decided the conversation wasn't worth her time. Brandon politely introduced himself and explained his concerns about the fence. "I just wanted to talk about the boundary line," he said, holding the property survey as evidence. "It looks like the fence is sitting well within my property. I was wondering if we could work something out to get it moved back to where it belongs." Evelyn's smile vanished, replaced by a steely glare. "That fence has been there for years," she snapped, though Brandon could tell by the fresh paint and pristine condition that this wasn't true. "It's on my land and I'm not moving it. Maybe you should double-check your documents." Brandon held his ground, trying to keep the conversation civil. "I did check my documents," he said evenly. "The survey clearly shows that the fence is on my side. I can share a copy with you if you'd like." Evelyn crossed her arms, her tone dripping with condescension. "Listen, young man, I've lived here for over 20 years, and I've never had any issues with this fence until now. If you're going to start making demands the second you move in, maybe you should reconsider whether this neighborhood is the right fit for you." It was clear the discussion wasn't going anywhere. Brandon thanked her for her time and left, frustrated but unwilling to escalate the situation further. For a few days he debated his next move. Part of him hoped she might reconsider and offer a compromise, but as the days passed without any communication from Evelyn, it became clear she had no intention of budging. Meanwhile, the fence continued to interfere with his plans. It wasn't just an eyesore, it was actively hindering his ability to use the land he'd worked so hard to acquire. After careful consideration and reviewing his legal rights, Brandon decided to take action. He hired a contractor to remove the fence, ensuring everything was done professionally and safely. Within a day, the fence was gone, leaving behind a clean, open space that finally felt like it belonged to him. Brandon felt a sense of relief as he looked at the cleared area. For the first time since moving in, his land felt whole. But his relief was short-lived. The very next morning, Brandon found a thick envelope waiting in his mailbox. It was from a local law firm, addressed to him with an urgency that made his stomach sink. Inside was a lawsuit filed by Evelyn, accusing him of destroying her property and causing emotional distress. She demanded compensation for the damages and insisted that the fence be rebuilt immediately. The language in the document was harsh, almost combative, and Brandon couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about the fence. Evelyn was determined to make his life as difficult as possible. As he stood on his porch, reading the legal notice over and over, Brandon felt a mixture of disbelief and anger. He had done everything by the book, yet he was now being dragged into a legal battle over something that was rightfully his. Looking out at his land, he realized this wasn't just about a fence, it was about standing up for himself and protecting the life he was trying to build. What he didn't know was that this fight would uncover secrets about the land and its history, pulling him into a conflict far more complicated than he could have ever imagined. The lawsuit from Evelyn hit Brandon like a freight train. As someone who always believed in resolving conflicts amicably, he was taken aback by the sheer aggressiveness of her legal approach. The document accused him of deliberate destruction of private property and demanded damages far exceeding the cost of the fence. But what struck Brandon most was the way Evelyn framed herself as the victim. She claimed the fence had been an integral part of her property for decades, that its removal had caused her irreparable emotional harm, and even suggested that Brandon had acted maliciously out of spite. It was absurd. He had done everything legally and carefully, with evidence to back his claims. Yet here he was, thrust into a situation that seemed designed to drain his energy and resources. Feeling out of his depth, Brandon reached out to a local law firm with experience in property disputes. Within a few days, he was sitting in the office of Rachel Warren, a sharp and no-nonsense attorney known for her success in cases involving land disputes. Rachel listened intently as Brandon explained the situation, occasionally jotting down notes. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair, her expression serious but calm. First of all, she began, you were within your rights to remove the fence if it was indeed on your property. But Evelyn's approach tells me one thing: she's trying to intimidate you. People don't usually go to these lengths unless they think they have something to gain or they're trying to cover something up. Brandon frowned. Cover something up? Like what? Rachel shrugged. It could be anything. Maybe she's just territorial, or maybe there's something about that piece of land she doesn't want you to know. Either way, our first step is to respond to this lawsuit with a clear defense. I'll file a motion to dismiss. But I'll also need you to provide me with every document you have, your deed, the property survey, even any communications you've had with Evelyn. Brandon nodded, relieved to have someone competent on his side. What about the fence? Can we prove it was on my property? Rachel smiled faintly. We can, but we'll need to be thorough. I suggest hiring a licensed surveyor to reconfirm the property boundaries. Their report will carry weight in court if it comes to that. I'll also subpoena any records Evelyn has that claim the fence was hers. If she's lying about its history, we'll expose it. Encouraged by Rachel's confidence, Brandon agreed to her plan. Over the next few days, he focused on gathering documents and reaching out to a reputable surveying company. In the meantime, Rachel filed the initial paperwork to counter Evelyn's claims, laying out Brandon's right to remove the fence based on his deed and property survey. The process was slow and frustrating, but Brandon tried to stay patient, trusting that the truth would prevail. But as the days turned into weeks, the situation began to escalate in ways Brandon hadn't anticipated. Evelyn wasn't content to let the legal battle play out quietly. She started a smear campaign against him in the neighborhood, painting him as an aggressive newcomer who didn't respect the community. Brandon noticed that neighbors who had once waved at him now avoided eye contact. His trash cans were mysteriously overturned one morning, and someone left a sarcastic note on his mailbox that read, "Welcome to the neighborhood, fence destroyer." At first, Brandon tried to brush it off as petty behavior, but the incidents became harder to ignore. One night, he heard rustling outside his window and caught a glimpse of someone walking along the edge of his property. The next morning, he found deep footprints in the soil near where the fence had been. It was unsettling, to say the least, but without clear evidence of who was responsible, there wasn't much he could do. The surveyors arrived later that week, bringing a sense of order back to the chaos. They spent hours meticulously measuring the land and confirmed what Brandon already knew: the fence had been well within his property line. They provided a detailed report, complete with diagrams and GPS coordinates, which Rachel immediately included in her response to Evelyn's lawsuit. Still, the tension lingered. Evelyn wasn't backing down. In fact, she seemed more emboldened than ever. One afternoon, Brandon came home to find a notice from the town council taped to his door. It was a formal complaint filed by Evelyn, accusing him of conducting unauthorized construction work and damaging the neighborhood aesthetic. The complaint cited the removal of the fence as evidence and warned that further violations could result in fines or legal action. Brandon could hardly believe the audacity. Not only was she suing him, but now she was trying to weaponize local bureaucracy against him. He immediately called Rachel, who was unsurprised but irritated by this new development. "She's trying to bury you in paperwork and stress," Rachel explained. "It's a classic tactic. She wants to make this so expensive and exhausting that you either settle or give up entirely. Don't take the bait. I'll handle the council complaint, just make sure you keep documenting everything." Following her advice, Brandon installed a set of security cameras around his property. He didn't want to escalate the situation, but the unexplained footprints and overturned trash cans were starting to feel like more than coincidence. If someone tried to mess with him again, he wanted proof. The cameras turned out to be a wise investment. Less than a week later, Brandon woke up to find a large pile of dirt dumped near the site where the fence had stood. It was fresh, as though someone had been digging during the night. Reviewing the footage, he saw two shadowy figures carrying shovels and working quickly under the cover of darkness. They weren't just trespassing, they were looking for something. Brandon shared the footage with Rachel, who was just as perplexed as he was. "This changes things," she said, studying the video. "If they're digging on your land, they must be after something specific. I'll file a police report, but we'll also need to dig into the history of the property. There's something here we're missing." At Rachel's suggestion, Brandon began researching the property's past. He combed through public records, old maps, and historical accounts of the area. What he found surprised him. Decades ago, the land had been home to a natural spring that supplied water to the entire neighborhood. The spring had been capped off years later when the area was developed, but its existence was still noted in some of the older deeds, including the one tied to Brandon's property. Could this be what Evelyn and her mysterious accomplices were after? Rachel seemed to think so. "If that spring is still viable, it could be worth a lot of money," she explained. "Water rights are no joke, especially in areas where resources are limited. It's possible Evelyn has known about this all along and built the fence to stake her claim." The realization left Brandon both angry and determined. This wasn't just a petty neighbor dispute, it was a calculated effort to take something valuable from him. He decided he wouldn't back down, no matter how hard Evelyn pushed. But as he prepared for the next phase of the legal battle, he couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Evelyn wasn't just fighting for a fence, she was fighting for control, and she was willing to do whatever it took to win. Brandon knew that the situation with Evelyn had escalated beyond a simple property dispute. The discovery of the digging and the connection to the long-forgotten natural spring on his land changed everything. If Evelyn had gone to such lengths to build a fence and then file a lawsuit, she must have been after something significant. The spring, if still active, could be a highly valuable resource. It explained her aggressiveness, her refusal to compromise, and the lengths she was willing to go to secure control over a piece of his property. But this realization also made Brandon more cautious. He was no longer dealing with a petty neighbor dispute. This was about greed, power, and possibly larger forces working behind the scenes. Rachel, ever the pragmatist, wasted no time in formulating a new strategy. "We need to get ahead of this," she said firmly during their next meeting. "The footage of those people digging on your land is critical. I've already filed a police report, but we need to use this as leverage in the lawsuit. If Evelyn is linked to these trespassers, it could completely discredit her case." "Do you think the spring is really what this is about?" Brandon asked. "It's starting to look that way," Rachel replied. "Water rights are incredibly valuable, especially in areas like this. If Evelyn knew about the spring and saw an opportunity to claim it, that would explain a lot. But we need to prove it. I've contacted a hydrologist to evaluate the land. If we can confirm the spring's existence, it changes everything." While waiting for the hydrologist's analysis, Brandon focused on securing his property. He upgraded the security cameras, installing additional ones near the area where the digging had occurred. He also put up temporary fencing around the site to deter further intrusions. It was a costly and time-consuming effort, but he couldn't afford to let his guard down. Despite his precautions, Evelyn didn't back off. She seemed to sense that Brandon was gaining the upper hand, and her tactics grew more aggressive. One morning, he found a letter from the local zoning board in his mailbox, informing him that a complaint had been filed against him for improper land use and unauthorized modifications. The complaint cited his removal of the fence and the installation of security measures, claiming they violated local regulations. Brandon immediately recognized Evelyn's hand in it. She was using every tool at her disposal to make his life difficult, hoping to bury him in red tape and force him to abandon the fight. Frustrated but undeterred, Brandon brought the letter to Rachel, who rolled her eyes as she read it. "This is classic harassment," she said. "She's trying to drag you into a bureaucratic nightmare. Don't worry, I'll handle this." But it's clear she's feeling cornered, and that makes her dangerous. Rachel's warning proved prophetic. A few days later, Brandon received an anonymous message slipped under his door. It was a single sheet of paper with a hastily scrawled note: "Stay out of this, or it won't end well for you." The threat was vague but chilling. Brandon's first instinct was to dismiss it as another of Evelyn's attempts to intimidate him, but the tension in the air was palpable. Something was shifting, and it wasn't in his favor. Later that week, the hydrologist arrived to conduct a preliminary assessment of the land. Brandon watched as the expert examined the soil, took water samples, and used specialized equipment to map the underground layers. The results were both exciting and alarming. The hydrologist confirmed that the spring still existed and was likely still viable. The water contained unique mineral properties, making it not only a valuable resource but potentially a lucrative one if exploited properly. "This is big," Rachel said when she reviewed the report. "If Evelyn knows about this, and I think it's safe to assume she does, it explains everything. She's not just fighting for a piece of land, she's trying to secure a resource that could be worth millions. This gives us a major advantage in court. But it also puts a target on your back. Be prepared for things to get worse before they get better." True to Rachel's prediction, the situation took another dark turn. One evening, as Brandon was reviewing his notes on the case, he heard a loud crash outside. He rushed to the window and saw that someone had thrown a brick through his car's windshield. Attached to it was another note: "This one more direct, you're making a mistake. Leave while you can." Brandon called the police, but they offered little more than a report and vague assurances that they would look into it. The escalating harassment left Brandon angry but resolute. He refused to let Evelyn or whoever else was behind this scare him off his own land. With Rachel's guidance, he began preparing for the upcoming court hearing, compiling every piece of evidence. They had the survey results, the footage of the trespassers, the hydrologist's report, and records of Evelyn's complaints to the zoning board. They also planned to introduce the police reports documenting the threats and vandalism, painting a clear picture of the lengths to which Evelyn was willing to go to intimidate him. As the court date approached, Brandon couldn't shake the feeling that Evelyn wasn't acting alone. The scale and coordination of the harassment suggested a level of organization beyond what he thought her capable of. His suspicions deepened when Rachel uncovered an interesting piece of information. Evelyn had recently been in contact with a local developer known for targeting properties with unique natural resources. The developer, a shadowy figure named Carter Industries, had a history of using underhanded tactics to pressure landowners into selling. Rachel couldn't yet prove a direct link between Evelyn and Carter Industries, but the timing was too convenient to ignore. Brandon decided to take proactive measures. He reached out to some of the older residents in the neighborhood, hoping to learn more about the history of the area and Evelyn's role in it. One elderly neighbor, Mr. Landry, revealed that Evelyn had always been ambitious, even ruthless, when it came to her property. Years ago, she had successfully pressured another neighbor into selling a small piece of land that had been adjacent to hers. "She's always wanted to expand," Mr. Landry said. "And she's not afraid to step on people to get what she wants." The pieces were falling into place. Evelyn wasn't just a difficult neighbor, she was part of a larger scheme to exploit the spring for financial gain. The realization gave Brandon a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about defending his property, it was about standing up to greed and corruption. As the court date loomed, Brandon fortified his defenses, both literal and figurative. He added more security measures to his property, ensuring that any future trespassers would be caught on camera. He worked closely with Rachel to finalize their legal strategy, determined to expose Evelyn's true motives in court. But as the day of the hearing drew closer, he couldn't help but wonder what Evelyn and her allies might do next. The battle was far from over, and Brandon knew he would need to stay one step ahead if he hoped to protect his land and his future. The morning of the court hearing came with an air of tension that Brandon couldn't shake. He dressed carefully, gathered his documents, and mentally prepared himself for what he expected to be a drawn-out legal battle. Rachel had been confident in their case, but she had also warned him to expect the unexpected. "People like Evelyn don't fight fair," she had said. "She'll try to catch us off guard. Stay calm and let the evidence speak for itself." Her words echoed in his mind as he walked into the courtroom, where Evelyn was already seated with her attorney. She wore an expression of smug confidence, her lips curling into a faint smile when their eyes met, as if she already believed she had won. The proceedings began predictably, with Evelyn's attorney launching into an emotional appeal about the devastating impact Brandon's actions had supposedly had on her client. Evelyn played the role of the victim perfectly, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief as her attorney described her decades of dedication to her property and the emotional toll of seeing her fence torn down. Brandon sat quietly, his hands clasped tightly together as he resisted the urge to roll his eyes. He knew Rachel would dismantle these theatrics when it was her turn to speak. When Rachel stood to present their defense, she exuded the calm authority that had made her one of the most respected attorneys in the region. She began by laying out the facts: the property survey proving the fence was on Brandon's land, the video footage of trespassers digging on his property, and the police reports documenting the harassment he had endured. Each piece of evidence was presented methodically, and with each passing moment, the confidence in Evelyn's expression began to falter. But it wasn't until Rachel brought up the hydrologist's report that the real cracks began to show. "This report confirms the existence of a natural spring on Mr. Reeves's property," Rachel said, holding up the document for the judge to see. "The spring has been dormant for years, but it remains a significant natural resource. We believe this is the true motivation behind Ms. Stanton's actions. She built her fence illegally to encroach on Mr. Reeves's land and gain access to the spring, knowing its potential value." The courtroom was silent for a moment before Evelyn's attorney scrambled to respond. "This is irrelevant," he said, his voice strained. "My client has no interest in the spring. She's simply trying to protect her property rights." Rachel didn't miss a beat. "Then why did Ms. Stanton file complaints with the zoning board, claiming unauthorized modifications on land that isn't even hers? Why were there individuals digging on Mr. Reeves's property under the cover of darkness? If my client hadn't installed security cameras, we wouldn't even know these trespassers were there." Evelyn's attorney tried to object, but Rachel pressed on. "And if Ms. Stanton has no interest in the spring, why has she been in contact with Carter Industries, a known developer with a history of targeting properties with natural resources? We have records of correspondence between Ms. Stanton and representatives from Carter Industries. I've submitted those documents as evidence." Brandon watched as Evelyn's composure cracked. Her hands clenched in her lap, and her confident smile was replaced by a strained grimace. The judge, clearly intrigued by the revelations, requested a recess to review the new evidence. As everyone filed out of the courtroom, Brandon felt a surge of hope. For the first time, it seemed like Evelyn's facade was beginning to crumble. But the battle was far from over. During the recess, Brandon and Rachel returned to a small conference room to regroup. "You're doing great," Rachel said, patting him on the shoulder. "But don't get too comfortable. Evelyn's attorney is going to come back swinging, and we need to be ready." Rachel was right. When the hearing resumed, Evelyn's attorney shifted tactics, trying to discredit Brandon's motives. He suggested that Brandon's interest in the spring was purely financial and accused him of planning to exploit it for profit at the expense of the neighborhood's peace and harmony. He even insinuated that Brandon's removal of the fence was a preemptive strike to establish dominance over the land. Brandon was stunned by the audacity of the claims, but Rachel remained unshaken. She calmly pointed out that Brandon had taken every action legally, citing his compliance with local regulations and his proactive efforts to document everything. She also highlighted Evelyn's pattern of harassment, from the baseless complaints to the anonymous threats and vandalism. By the time Rachel finished, the judge seemed unimpressed by Evelyn's attorney's arguments. Just when it seemed like the case was leaning heavily in Brandon's favor, Evelyn took the stand. Her testimony was a masterclass in manipulation. She painted herself as a dedicated member of the community, someone who had only ever acted in the best interests of the neighborhood. She even claimed that the digging on Brandon's property had been a misunderstanding, blaming it on overzealous contractors who had misinterpreted her instructions. "I would never intentionally violate anyone's property," she said, her voice trembling with feigned sincerity. "I only wanted to ensure that our neighborhood remained safe and beautiful for everyone." Despite the theatrics, Rachel managed to poke holes in Evelyn's story during cross-examination. She questioned Evelyn about her communications with Carter Industries, forcing her to admit that she had been in discussions with the developer. When asked why she hadn't disclosed this earlier, Evelyn stumbled over her words, claiming it had nothing to do with the spring. The judge's expression made it clear he wasn't buying it. As the hearing stretched into the afternoon, Brandon began to feel the weight of the day. The back and forth between the attorneys was exhausting, and Evelyn's relentless attempts to vilify him took a toll on his patience. But he knew he had to stay composed. This wasn't just about winning the case, it was about standing up for himself and protecting the land he had worked so hard to secure. The turning point came when Rachel introduced a witness, Mr. Landry, the elderly neighbor who had lived in the area for decades. Mr. Landry testified about Evelyn's history of aggressive behavior, recounting how she had pressured another neighbor into selling part of their land years ago. "She's always been like this," he said, his voice steady despite his age. "She wants more and more, and she doesn't care who she steps on to get it." His testimony was a blow to Evelyn's credibility, and Rachel used it to reinforce their argument. "This isn't just a simple property dispute," she told the court in her closing statement. "This is a case of greed and manipulation. Ms. Stanton has a history of exploiting her neighbors to serve her own interests, and this time she's gone too far." As the judge adjourned the hearing to deliberate, Brandon felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. They had presented a strong case, but he knew the outcome was far from guaranteed. Evelyn had proven herself to be a formidable opponent, and her connections to powerful entities like Carter Industries made her even more dangerous. That evening, Brandon returned home to find an envelope taped to his door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short, cryptic message: "This isn't over." It was a chilling reminder that, no matter what happened in court, the fight for his land was far from finished. Brandon took a deep breath and resolved to stay vigilant. He had come too far to back down now. Whatever Evelyn and her allies had planned next, he would be ready. The days following the court hearing were anything but calm. Brandon felt like he was living under constant surveillance, with every shadow or unfamiliar car on the street setting him on edge. The cryptic note left on his door after the hearing, "This isn't over," remained fresh in his mind, a stark reminder that Evelyn wasn't finished with her schemes. Though the court case had gone well so far, Brandon knew that Evelyn's desperation and connections made her unpredictable and dangerous. If anything, the hearing had only made her more determined to fight back, using any means necessary. Rachel had warned him that the next stage of the conflict would likely escalate beyond the courtroom, and she was right. Within a week, Brandon began noticing small but unsettling changes around his property. His mail delivery was suddenly irregular, with important letters, including updates from his attorney, arriving days late or not at all. He found a section of his garden trampled, as if someone had walked across it deliberately. And once, the power to his outdoor security cameras mysteriously cut out in the middle of the night. Though Brandon managed to repair the system quickly, it was clear that someone was testing his resolve, trying to wear him down. Then came the first major incident. Late one evening, Brandon returned from a grocery run to find a black SUV idling at the edge of his driveway. Its windows were tinted, obscuring the driver, but the vehicle's presence felt deliberate, like a warning. Brandon parked his car and stepped out cautiously, his phone in hand. Before he could approach the SUV, it sped off, kicking up gravel as it disappeared down the road. Though the encounter was brief, it left Brandon rattled. He replayed the moment in his head over and over that night, wondering if the SUV was connected to Evelyn or her shadowy developer allies. Determined not to let fear dictate his actions, Brandon contacted Rachel the next morning and told her about the incident. "It's not surprising," she said, her tone calm but firm. "People like Evelyn and the developer she's working with rely on intimidation. They want you to feel isolated and vulnerable. But remember, this only means they see you as a threat. We're making progress, and they're trying to shake you." Rachel's reassurance helped, but the tension continued to build. A few days later, Brandon received another blow, a letter from the town council informing him that Evelyn had filed yet another complaint against him, this time accusing him of violating environmental regulations. According to the complaint, his removal of the fence and installation of security cameras had supposedly disrupted local wildlife habitats. The letter threatened fines and even legal action if the violations weren't addressed promptly. Brandon couldn't believe the lengths Evelyn was going to in her vendetta. It was clear she was weaponizing every bureaucratic avenue she could find, hoping to overwhelm him with paperwork and financial strain. He forwarded the letter to Rachel, who was predictably unimpressed. "She's grasping at straws," Rachel said. "This complaint is completely baseless, and I'll handle it. But it's another sign that she's feeling desperate. We need to stay the course." Even as Rachel worked to counter Evelyn's complaints, Brandon's property became a battleground. One morning, he woke up to find a large pile of trash dumped at the edge of his land. Old furniture, broken appliances, and bags of rotting garbage littered the area, an intentional act of vandalism meant to send a message. Reviewing his security footage, Brandon saw a truck pulling up in the middle of the night and dumping the trash before speeding off. Though the footage wasn't clear enough to identify the driver, Brandon had no doubt it was connected to Evelyn's ongoing campaign against him. The stress was starting to take a toll. Brandon found it harder to focus on his work, and his once peaceful home now felt like a war zone. But each act of aggression only strengthened his resolve. He refused to let Evelyn bully him off his land. Taking Rachel's advice, he documented every incident meticulously, from the vandalism to the council complaints, building a comprehensive case against Evelyn's harassment. He also hired a local security company to patrol his property at night, ensuring there were no further intrusions. Despite these precautions, Evelyn showed no signs of relenting. At one point, Brandon noticed several unfamiliar men walking along the edge of his property, wearing construction boots and carrying clipboards. When he approached them to ask what they were doing, they claimed to be conducting routine inspections for a potential development project. Brandon immediately recognized this as another move by Carter Industries, the developer Rachel had linked to Evelyn. Though the men left without incident, their presence confirmed his worst fears. Carter Industries wasn't just advising Evelyn, they were actively involved, scouting his property for their own gain. Rachel responded to the news with characteristic pragmatism. "This is good," she said when Brandon told her about the men. "It gives us more evidence to connect Evelyn to Carter Industries. If we can prove that she's colluding with a developer to pressure you into selling, it'll destroy her credibility in court. But we need more than just your word. Did you get any photos or footage?" Brandon hadn't been able to capture the encounter on camera, but he resolved to be more prepared in the future. He upgraded his security system once again, adding motion-activated floodlights and additional cameras to cover every angle of his property. He also began carrying a small voice recorder whenever he walked the perimeter, ready to document any further encounters. The turning point came when Rachel uncovered a critical piece of evidence. Through her network of contacts, she obtained internal emails from Carter Industries that mentioned Evelyn by name. The emails revealed that Evelyn had been working with the developer for months, providing information about Brandon's property in the spring. One email even outlined a proposed plan to pressure Brandon into selling by filing complaints and escalating harassment tactics. When Rachel shared the emails with Brandon, he felt a mix of anger and vindication. This was the smoking gun they needed to expose Evelyn's true motives. This changes everything Rachel said. With these emails, we can prove that Evelyn's lawsuit isn't about the fence, it's about greed. She's trying to steal your land to sell it to a developer. And we're going to make sure the court sees that. But even with this newfound leverage, Brandon knew the fight wasn't over. Evelyn and Carter Industries weren't going to back down quietly. In fact, their next move came almost immediately. Late one night, Brandon was awakened by the sound of shattering glass. He rushed outside to find that one of his windows had been smashed, and a spray-painted message on his wall read, "Get out." It was the most direct threat yet, and it left Brandon shaken. He called the police, but once again, their response was underwhelming. The officer who arrived took a report but seemed reluctant to take any real action. "These kinds of things are hard to trace," the officer said with a shrug. "Just stay vigilant and let us know if it happens again." Frustrated but determined, Brandon doubled down on his efforts to protect himself and his property. He reinforced his home's windows, installed additional locks, and worked closely with Rachel to ensure they were fully prepared for the next phase of the legal battle. With the emails from Carter Industries and the mounting evidence of harassment, they had a strong case, but Brandon knew Evelyn wouldn't go down without a fight. As he stood on his porch that night, staring at the defaced wall and the shattered glass, Brandon felt a surge of resolve. Evelyn and her allies had underestimated him, thinking they could bully him into submission. But he wasn't going anywhere. This was his land, his home, and he would fight for it with everything he had. The battle was far from over, but Brandon was ready for whatever came next. The courtroom was packed as the final hearing began, the air thick with tension. Evelyn sat at her table, flanked by her attorney and a few associates who seemed more concerned with their phones than the proceedings. Brandon, in contrast, sat beside Rachel, his shoulders squared and his focus unshakable. Today was the culmination of everything he had endured: the threats, the vandalism, the harassment. Rachel had told him to prepare for a battle, but she had also assured him that they were ready. The evidence they had gathered was airtight, and Evelyn's web of deceit was on the verge of unraveling. The hearing started with Evelyn's attorney once again trying to frame Brandon as the aggressor. He painted a picture of a disruptive newcomer who had destroyed his neighbor's property and caused unnecessary conflict in a peaceful community. Evelyn herself took the stand, performing with the same rehearsed theatrics she'd displayed in previous hearings. She spoke of her dedication to preserving the neighborhood, her supposed fear for her safety due to Brandon's aggressive behavior, and how the loss of the fence had violated her sense of security. Brandon clenched his fists under the table as he listened, but Rachel placed a calming hand on his arm. When it was her turn to cross-examine Evelyn, her tone was razor-sharp but controlled. "Ms. Stanton." Rachel began, "You've claimed repeatedly that the fence was on your property, yet you've provided no survey or legal document to support this claim. Do you have any such evidence to present to the court today?" Evelyn hesitated, her confidence faltering for the first time. "Well, I wasn't aware I needed to provide that," she stammered. "The fence has always been there. It's common knowledge." Rachel's expression didn't change. "Common knowledge is not legal evidence, Ms. Stanton. However, we do have evidence." She turned to the judge and handed over the surveyor's report. "This document, prepared by a licensed surveyor, confirms that the fence was built well within my client's property line. It was an illegal structure from the start." The judge examined the report, his expression neutral but attentive. Evelyn's attorney tried to object, claiming the report was incomplete, but Rachel swiftly countered, pointing out its official certification and accuracy. The court moved on, but the tide was clearly beginning to turn. Rachel wasn't finished. She called Brandon to the stand, guiding him through a calm and factual recounting of the events. He described discovering the misplaced fence, his attempts to resolve the issue amicably, and the escalating harassment he endured after removing it. Rachel presented the security footage of trespassers digging on his property, the vandalism reports, and the threatening notes. The evidence painted a clear picture of a campaign of intimidation designed to force Brandon into submission. When it was time for Rachel's closing arguments, she delivered the final blow. This case isn't about offense, she said, her voice firm and resonant. This is about greed and manipulation. M.S. Stanton, in collaboration with Carter Industries, sought to exploit a valuable natural resource on my client's property. They used harassment, intimidation, and deceit to try to force him off his land. But today, the truth is clear. My client acted within his rights every step of the way. The only wrongdoing here is M.S. Stanton's calculated effort to steal what doesn't belong to her. Evelyn's attorney tried to recover, calling his own witnesses to rebut Rachel's claims. But the tide had shifted irreversibly. The emails Rachel had obtained from Carter Industries were the nail in the coffin. Presented as evidence, they revealed detailed plans to acquire Brandon's land, with Evelyn playing a central role in the scheme. One email even discussed the potential financial windfall from reopening the natural spring, tying Evelyn and the developers directly to the harassment Brandon had endured. As the judge called for a brief recess to review the final evidence, Evelyn's composure crumbled. Brandon watched as she leaned toward her attorney, whispering furiously, her face pale and panicked. It was a stark contrast to the smug confidence she had exuded just weeks ago. When the judge returned, the courtroom fell silent. He delivered a scathing verdict. The evidence overwhelmingly supported Brandon's claims, and Evelyn's actions were deemed malicious and unlawful. The judge ordered Evelyn to pay damages for the harassment and vandalism, as well as cover Brandon's legal fees. Additionally, he referred the case to local authorities for further investigation into Carter Industries' involvement, stating that their conduct warranted closer scrutiny. Brandon felt a wave of relief and vindication wash over him as the verdict was read. He glanced at Rachel, who gave him a satisfied nod. Evelyn, meanwhile, sat frozen in her chair, her expression a mix of shock and defeat. Her attorney quickly began packing up their files, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room. As the courtroom emptied, Brandon allowed himself a small smile. It wasn't just a victory for him, it was a victory for anyone who had ever been bullied or intimidated into silence. Evelyn had underestimated him, and now her schemes had been exposed for all to see. But as satisfying as the moment was, Brandon knew this wasn't the end. Carter Industries was still out there, and the fight to protect his land might not be over. For now, though, he had won the battle, and that was enough. The weeks following the court's verdict brought a calm that Brandon hadn't experienced in months. Evelyn, stripped of her leverage and facing mounting legal troubles, retreated from the neighborhood entirely. Her once imposing presence was replaced by silence, her home now sitting empty with a for sale sign staked unceremoniously in the yard. The neighbors, many of whom had turned against Brandon during the height of the conflict, now approached him cautiously, offering quiet apologies and awkward explanations. Some admitted they had sided with Evelyn out of fear of her influence, while others confessed they hadn't fully understood the situation. Brandon accepted their apologies with grace, though he remained guarded. Trust was hard to rebuild after what he had been through. The repairs to his property took time, but Brandon threw himself into the work with renewed energy. He removed the remnants of Evelyn's fence, replanted his garden, and restored the areas damaged by the trespassers. Each swing of the hammer and turn of the soil felt like reclaiming a part of himself that had been stolen during the ordeal. The spring, now confirmed as a valuable natural resource, remained a focal point of the property. After consulting with environmental experts, Brandon decided to protect it, ensuring it would remain untouched and preserved for future generations. Rachel stayed in touch, keeping him updated on the ongoing investigation into Carter Industries. The developers, it seemed, had underestimated the reach of the legal system. The emails presented during the trial had opened a Pandora's box of scrutiny, leading to further inquiries into their business practices. Brandon took quiet satisfaction in knowing that his fight had not only exposed Evelyn's greed but also disrupted a much larger scheme. One sunny afternoon, as Brandon worked in his garden, Mr. Landry, the elderly neighbor who had testified on his behalf, stopped by. The old man leaned on his cane, surveying the now peaceful property with a faint smile. "You did good, Brandon," he said. "It's not easy standing up to people like Evelyn. Most folks would have folded, but you didn't. That's something to be proud of." "Thanks, Mr. Landry," Brandon replied, wiping sweat from his brow. I didn't feel strong most of the time, but I couldn't let them take what's mine. Not without a fight. Landry chuckled softly. That's all any of us can do, son. Fight for what's right. As the days turned into weeks, Brandon began to rebuild not just his property, but his life. The land, once a source of stress and conflict, became a place of solace again. His plans for an organic garden flourished, and the natural beauty of the area started to return. He even began hosting small gatherings with the neighbors who had stood by him, sharing stories and forging new friendships. Evelyn's departure had left a lasting mark on the community. Her downfall served as a cautionary tale about greed and the consequences of underestimating others. While some neighbors lamented the loss of her influence, most seemed relieved to see her go. The air felt lighter, as though the neighborhood itself was breathing easier. One evening, as Brandon sat on his porch with a cup of tea, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The fight with Evelyn had been exhausting, but it had also taught him the value of resilience and the importance of standing firm in the face of adversity. His land was more than just a property, it was a symbol of his determination, a testament to the fact that even the most ordinary person could push back against powerful forces and win. The gentle sound of the nearby spring bubbling in the distance brought a smile to his face. The land was his, and it would remain so, protected and cherished. For the first time in months, Brandon allowed himself to feel at peace.